If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
48.
Willing to die for.
48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self? The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking
die
about
for.
tribal self.
48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yet unborn, and those who are the
How
ancestors.
long is your list?
So the connection with the ancestors is tied into the tribal self.
48.
What does that mean? That means that the tribal self constantly reminds us
Willing to die for.
that we don't have the
How
right
long is your
to
list?
claim independence.
48.
What we're gonna be going over is the degrees of codependency and the levels of control. Now, I always like to start this off with this particular class off in reference to 48 Laws of Power. And if you're not familiar with that book, I definitely suggest y'all get it. That's a book by Robert Greene. And the thing about that book, and others like that book, is actually found in the business section of the bookstore. And then when we talk about this, it's obvious as to why it's important that everyone is aware of this concept. So 48 Laws of Power, law number 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. To maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. The more you are relied on, the more freedom you have. Make people depend on you for their happiness and prosperity, and you have nothing to fear. Never teach them enough so that they can do without you. So again, that is law number 11 that's taught to business administrative people on a regular basis. So in starting off talking about the concept of codependency right off the bat is being taught to people in the business world that you must keep people dependent upon you. So in essence, everything we're going to cover just kind of dives deeper into that. So first, let's talk about this from the standpoint of the three forms of dependence. And this is important because not often enough do you hear people really break this down in this way. So we start with codependence. Codependence, a behavior and psychological condition characterized by excessive reliance on others for self-worth, identity, or means of survival, and often involves enabling or controlling behaviors in relationships of the dependent party. The next one would be interdependence. Is a mutually beneficial and interconnected relationship whereas all parties rely on each other for support, resources, and cooperation. It is based on the idea that no individual entity can function independently or in isolation from a natural ecosystem. The mutual recognition of importance in collaboration and interconnection for achieving common goals or meeting collective needs is understood as the foundation for coexistence. Now, what's important about that is that goes into the aspect of recognizing natural law as it applies to what we see happening currently with global warming and with how humanity is destroying the natural protective layers of how this planet is able to maintain life and maintain an ecosystem. This past week, we've encountered 2 days in a row, Monday and Tuesday, to where each day we broke the record for that, we would say record in terms of since it's been modern times, it's been kept as the planet, as the hottest the planet has been. So if y'all not hip to that, that's very important. Again, Monday and Tuesday, Monday we broke a record. Tuesday we broke that record that we just made in terms of the planet being the hottest it's been since it's been recorded and kept up with in our modern time. And that's super important. The last aspect of in regards to dependence is independence, is when the people have established themselves as a nation, having sovereignty, forming a constitution, government, citizenship, and control of land, and being recognized as such, the people also can enact a military for protection of its borders and national security, possessing the ability to directly exercise and practice level of power in freedom and self-determination. And that's where we want to be, is when we talk about the three forms of dependence, we find ourselves currently dealing with codependence. But as humanity, we're supposed to be operating through interdependence. And as Black people specifically, we're supposed to also have our independence here in the United States. So we have to know the difference between these three. Within the Panther Party, the Black Panther Party, we got this thing that we talk about the 3Ds, which is define, develop, and defend. And the thing about that is as a people, we're not defining what is in our best interest. If we're not defining our destiny, then we find that we will be easily coerced and be victims of codependence, which allows law number 11 here to keep the people dependent upon you to take total control of our lives. And so when we talk about collective operation and freedom, it's important to deal with this, because here this past week, the country celebrated its quote unquote independence, the 4th of July. And oftentimes Black people celebrate that right along with the founding members of this country, quote unquote colonizers, in terms of how this country was established. And we tend to think that we're operating from a position of independence, when in fact, we're dealing with a form of emancipation. And breaking that down, emancipation is free from slavery or bondage, physically having the ability to exist in part with a society at greater levels of servitude. This also grants the ability to have rights and participate in the economy, as opposed to being a commodity of the economy, which is debatable whether that's still the case. Emancipation does not equate to independence. It identifies with the rights of the individual within a social group, but that group is still under the imposed wills of the government, therefore subject to the reinstitution of bondage. The Black Code, sometimes called the Black Laws and Jim Crow laws, were laws which governed the conduct of African Americans, both freed and freedmen, in order to subjugate the freed slaves back into servitude and to control the level of development and power to ensure white supremacy is maintained and the Blacks would not gain a fair advantage and form independent territories within occupied lands. They must never be allowed to be equals. This is the conversation and what was going on during the time of the quote unquote, when the slaves got freed, which takes us into the next section here to expand a little bit more on that. Black people in the United States of America, released from physical bondage, have yet to form independence. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution abolished slavery and voluntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. The amendment was passed by the Senate on April the 8th, 1864, by the House of Representatives on January the 31st, 1865, and ratified by the required 27 of the 36 states on December the 6th, 1865, and proclaimed on December 18th. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, effective on January the 1st, 1863, declared that the slaves in Confederate controlled areas were free. Texas was the last Confederate territory reached by the Union Army. On June 19, 1865, U.S. Army General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to proclaim civil war and slavery had ended in the Confederate States. And it's emphasized Confederate States. And this is a thing here that most people don't think about. In the slave-owning areas controlled by Union forces on January the 1st, 1863, states' action was used to abolish slavery. Here goes a kicker: except where exceptions were New Jersey, Kentucky, Delaware, were all forms of forced labor and slavery were finally ended by the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. So even though Black people collectively, think of June 19th as being when the rest of us realized we were free, you actually had this reflected the Confederate controlled states, whereas the Union certain states in the Union still maintained it even after June 19th, which didn't end into December of the same year, when that was New Jersey, Kentucky, and Delaware. Most people don't know that. Most people simply refer to the latest of it being found out on June 19th. But that's because you're only thinking about the Confederate and not what the Union was doing. And so with that, let me go into the disclaimer and then open it up to any questions in regards to what we covered so far. So in disclaimer here, it's important to note that dependency in certain contexts can be healthy and normal, while collective dependency and codependency is detrimental when factoring into accountability, the ability to implement people power, self-sufficiency, or self-determination. The creation of dependency in this fashion is meant to impose psychological limitations to mold an inferior class of people, effectively rendering them domesticated. Anybody got any questions or comments on what we talked about so far? All right.
Hey,
Go ahead, Coyote.
Yeah, all power to the people. I think on the independence or interdependence and independence point, because we live in a society that's very much based on like specifically Reformation or like Puritan Christian values, we abstract ourselves from, as you stated, natural law. But as we kind of move away from that and kind of look a bit more objectively, we see the interdependence not just with each other and with society as a whole. And then I think, kind of to touch on your point about Juneteenth, it's like it's a very convenient narrative that for the victor of that struggle to say, oh well, when we finally made it to the last enemy state, then we ended slavery. But in reality, we can see that that's not the case.
Right. In terms of how you're reflecting on interdependence, that kind of goes into the whole aspect of globalization and how nations and countries depend upon each other in order to keep the ecosystems going. I'm sorry, the ecosystem, economic systems going, which we're going to kind of get into, which is really the heart and meat of the discussion here of the document that I'm going to talk to y'all about here in just a second. So,
Brother Matt,
go ahead. Someone got a question?
Brother Teacher, can you speak? Yes, sir. Brother Teacher, this is Wesley Griffin. I want to get you to expound on social dependency. How can you give an understanding how we are socially dependent on the system? I yield with that.
Thank you, brother. Actually, we're going to talk about that further on down. So let me hold off on that one until we get to that aspect. But in saying that, now what we want to do is talk about dissecting degrees of dependency as it applies to social levels of dependency. So within that, one of them would be dealing with the social dependency aspect. But we start off with what we call physical dependency. Needing someone for physical care, assistance, growth, or support. This is natural when in the context of children rendering, but is weaponized when the ability to self-direct is not allowed to be acquired over time to pace exposure to independence. So again, we're going into this with the recognition that there are different types and ways that dependency takes hold of people. So the next one being emotional dependency, relying on others for emotional support, validation, or happiness, which goes into the fact that especially when we're talking about, obviously, when we're talking about adulthood, if that's the case, then that has to do with the fact that a person may not actually be in the right place of recognizing what love is from an unconditional standpoint, as well as being limited in their spiritual awareness to know that you cannot love anyone more than yourself, and to rely upon others for validation and happiness as it applies to that means that we are dealing with a certain types of dysfunctionality as it applies to that person. So it creates that dependency aspect. Now, cultural dependency, depending on cultural norms, practices, or beliefs for identity or validation. As captive Africans that suffered from stolen legacy, the lack of collective definition causes the easy assimilation into a subculture of dependence. And that's what's important because, again, we're dealing with stolen legacy and we're dealing with the fact that we're talking about having a lack of collective definition, which is why within Black Panther formations and the Panther formations, we talk about define, develop, and defend. And so we as a people and as revolutionaries for a cause, we must be able to define what it means to deal with all elements of our life. Otherwise, what we're doing, again, is dealing with a form of dependency, which renders us incapable of being able to be in control of our own destiny. Next one, intellectual dependency, relying upon others for knowledge, information, or expertise. This relationship as a means of social engineering and control is being more prevalent with the intended reliance upon smart devices and artificial intelligence. And that's super concerning because artificial intelligence is moving toward a position of what's called general intelligence. And when it reached levels of general intelligence, especially being weaponized against a population, it'll get to the point to where there's no true way to be able to tell oftentimes whether what you're hearing, being told, or visually seeing is actually real. So keep that in mind. Virtual reality is moving to a very expanded high pace. And so when artificial intelligence gets to the point of general intelligence, it's going to be a whole new level of the game that we have to be concerned with. Financial dependency. Depending on others for financial resources or support. This also reflects the inability of a people to engage in collective resource awareness and use for empowerment, as opposed to the overglorification of individual accumulation and consumption. Now let me break that down, because when we talk about to engage in collective resource awareness, the thing is when a people operate through a domesticated lens that we're referring to based upon a codependency, they're not going to have an awareness of what it means to collectively be in control of your own resources, land being the most powerful element of that, and everything contained within land. And so by not having that awareness, then you're not going to have a use for empowerment with that awareness, because if you're not aware, then collectively you're not going to empower yourself and use it. And therefore you get an overglorification of individual accumulation and consumption. So what you find is this is how you can have a country to where there may be many Black millionaires, but there's not Black bank. There's very few or very little controlled Black banks, grocery stores, and means of production that can be applied toward actual neighborhoods to create Black empowerment and circles of empowerment and control of resources. But on an individual level, yes, you can have accumulation and consumption, but because the people themselves are not recognizing the difference between simply being emancipated and having independence, they won't move to this level of recognition. So that brings us to this first point that I want to raise here. Silent weapons for quiet wars. I linked the information to this document down in the resources, but a lot of what we're going to talk about is reflecting back on this. So abstract number 1, social welfare. And this is powerful. Check this out. The problem with stabilizing the economic system is that there is too much demand on account for 1, too much greed, and number 2, too much population. So they're saying right there that it is for those that are in power, you have too much greed, and for the rest, the population is too large. This creates excessive economic inductance, which can only be balanced with economic capacitance. The true resources of value in goods or services. I come to you next, Crystal. Let me finish this one point here. The social welfare program is nothing more than an open-ended credit balance system which creates a false capital industry to give non-productive people a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs. This is what they think about us. This can be useful, however, because the recipients become state property in return for the gift, a standing army for the elite, for he who pays the piper picks the tune. And that's real powerful. Those who get hooked on the economic drug must go to the elite for a fix. In this, the method of inducing large amounts of stabilizing capacitance is by borrowing on future credit of the world. This is the fourth law of motion, onset and concise for performing an action and leaving the system before it reflected reaction returns to the point of the action, a delayed reaction. The means of surviving the reaction is by changing the system before the reaction can return. By this means, politicians become the more popular in their own time and the public pays later. In fact, the measure of such a politician is the delay time. The same thing is achieved by the government by printing money beyond the limit of the gross national product, an economic process called inflation. This puts a large quantity of money into the hands of the public and maintains a balance against their greed, creates a false self-confidence in them, and for a while stays the wolf at the door. They must eventually resort to war to balance the account, because war ultimately is merely the act of destroying the creditor, and the politicians are the publicly hired hitmen that justify the act to keep the responsibility and blood off the public conscience. If the people really cared about their fellow man, they would control their appetites, which is why we talk about within the Panther Party, recognizing and developing the proper appetites that we need for accountability, which when they talk about these appetites, greed, procreation, etc., so that they would not have to operate on credit or welfare systems, which steals from the worker and satisfies the bum. Since most of the general public would not exercise restraint, there is only two alternatives to reduce the economic inductance of a system. Let the population bludgeon each other to death in war, which will only result in total destruction of the living earth. Or number two, take control of the world by use of economic silent weapons in a form of quiet warfare, and reduce the economic inductance of the world to a safe level by a process of benevolent slavery and genocide. That's powerful. Go ahead, Sister Chris. Your mic is not muted, but I can't hear you if you're talking. Can anybody hear Chris? I want to make sure it's not me.
No, I can't hear her.
No, sir.
I can't hear you.
No.
All right, you might have to go out and come back in. Anybody else got anything to state about this part? All right, let me keep going here. All right, social support dependency. Keep going on in terms of what we're doing now is continuing with defining the aspects of dependency. Reliance on others for social connections, companionship, or assistance. The trend to recoding ourselves is a virtual environment has led to the lack of focus on building strong relationships that embrace differences of opinion and diversity in thought for the sake of unity and collective empowerment. Our inabilities to work together comes as a byproduct of it being easier to form bonds with those who we are able to isolate within an analytical framework, or filtering out alternative viewpoints to the same means, which goes into the discussion I was saying in regards to what happens with social media. Comrade Crystal, you want to see if you can talk?
See, can y'all hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, Black Power, comrades. Thank you, Comrade Warren. When you were talking about social welfare, it just, it goes hand in hand that we have to acknowledge that social welfare is a result of a social warfare. We did not get in the situation of dependency without it being a constant war on our people since the 1860s and beyond. Because remember, we set up immediately after chattel slavery, or so-called into chattel slavery, we set up immediately black townships, black business districts, and things of that nature. And we were educating ourselves, and we had no choice, But there was direct acts of warfare by creating unions, by creating slave codes, by blockbustering and running railroads through every neighborhood. Highways through every black township. They even flooded many black townships and went through all kinds of heinous acts of warfare. And most of the people that were lynched, people don't know or don't talk about, were black businessmen, a good majority. So, and then in turning around and taking, destroying these social means that our ancestors knew to do from the beginning, and then turning our educational systems, over until the same people who lynched us, bombed us, enslaved us, till we got just 2 generations from our ancestors, from our parents, who don't even recognize or know that we had all of these things, and so those are acts of warfare, and then they turn around and act as if, black people don't do business together, black people don't do this anymore, but these were direct acts of warfare. And so to counter that, we have to, put these things into perspective, but also, like you said, to re-engage, like with this world of AI and all of that, we can take control of the stuff and not be the victim. We can create our own digital banks. We can create our own imagery and technology, but we have to look at what actually happened before and see how to not, allow it to take place in the next generation, and engage in, self-defensive ways of countering the warfare and the welfare, the codependency. But, just coming up with specific examples that are practical, that we can see, that we can develop amongst our own communities. Our grandparents were less educated than we were, and they had much more as far as family values, as far as developing communities. So we need to be self-determined in that manner, because this is our warfare. Black power.
Black power. Thank you for that, Sister Crystal.
Black
And the
power.
whole point of this, having this discussion, goes into the element of recognizing that if we don't call it for what it is, a form of weaponization being used against us, and that's what dependency is, then we won't be in the right mind frame, in the right outlook to recognize how social engineering is controlling us. So that's the essence of this class, is to give definition to what dependency is and its different factors of dependency, whether we talk about codependency, interdependency, or independence, because people, believe it or not, at large really don't understand the essence of what those mean. And you can't fight an enemy that you can't even define, which could be in essence how you operate, because you don't see yourself operating against your own well-being. Somebody got their hand up that says Zoom user.
I believe that's me.
Yes, sir. It's you.
Power to the people.
All the people.
I just wanted to add on to what Sister Crystal said. In the event that maybe you all understand this, a lot of the created lakes we have, maybe not all of them, but a good portion of them were actually black-owned townships. Just like with the railways,
they got flooded over intentionally.
Intentionally, yes, to build that infrastructure. So if you have time, check into that. But as they were saying.
Yep, and it just goes into the point both of y'all making, is recognizing, and we had a class on that, recognizing that we are at war and defining that aspect. Because when we realize we are at war as a people, then we will approach the battlefield engaging war, as opposed to how we operate now through assimilation. And so let me keep going here.
Brother Teacher, can I add on what they just said as it deals with what was done to our communities, let's keep in mind that we're still going through that same process. They're just doing it a different way up under the title of gentrification. And so the same process is being done. It's just being engineered through a different way. And so it is so vital and essential that we have educational classes such as this, that Master Teacher is offering us such vital information for us to be effective in this war, because, you know, even the divine word says that our people perish for lack of knowledge. I believe that it's inappropriate knowledge today that we're using for problem solving. We're having knowledge that's outdated, that's not effective enough to make that solidified change for our people. And so I just wanted to interject there, and I yield there, Brother Teacher.
Thank you. Let me go into this next one here. Silent weapons for quiet wars, extract number 2, social welfare and the political structure of a nation, dependency. The primary reason why the individual citizens of a country create a political structure is a subconscious wish or desire to perpetuate their own dependency relationships of childhood. Simply put, they want a human God to eliminate all risk of their life, pat them on the head, kiss their bruises, put a chicken on every dinner table, clothe their bodies, tuck them into bed at night, and tell them that everything will be all right when they wake up in the morning. This public demand is incredible, so the human God, the politician, meets incredibility with incredibility by promising the world and delivering nothing. So who is the bigger liar, the public or the Godfather? This public behavior is surrender born in fear, laziness, and expediency. It is the basis of the welfare state as a strategic weapon useful against a disgusting public. And remember now, this is being read verbatim from a document called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. Another section here within that same document, action and offense. Most people want to be able to subdue and or kill other human beings with which disturb their daily lives, but they do not want to have to cope with the moral or religious issues in which an overt act on their part might arise. Therefore, they assign the dirty work to the others, including their own children, so as to keep the blood off their hands. They rave about the humane treatment of animals, and then sit down at to a delicious hamburger from a whitewashed slaughterhouse down the street and out of sight. But even more hypocritical, they pay taxes to finance a professional association of hitmen, collectively called politicians, and then complain about corruption in government. Responsibility. Again, most people want to be free to do things, to explore, etc., but they are afraid to fail. The fear of failure is manifested in irresponsibility, and especially in delegating those personal responsibilities to others, where success is uncertain or carries possible or create liabilities, laws, which the person is not prepared to accept. They want authority, root word, author, but they will not accept responsibility or liability. So they hire politicians to face reality for them. That's powerful when you think about how it's being worded. In summary here, the people hire politicians so that the people can obtain security without managing it, obtain action without thinking about it, inflict thief, theft, injury, and death upon others without having to contemplate either life or death, avoid responsibility for their own intentions, obtain the benefits of reality and science without exerting themselves in a discipline or facing or learning either of these things. They give the politician the power to create and manage war machine to provide for the survival of a nation/womb, prevent encroachment of anything upon the nation womb, destroy the enemy who threatens the nation womb, destroy those citizens of their own country who do not conform to for the sake of stability of the nation womb. Politicians may hold many quasi-military jobs, the lowest being the police, which are soldiers, the attorneys, the CPAs, next who are the spies and saboteurs licensed, and the judges who shout out orders and run the closed union military shop for whatever the market will bear, the generals who are industrialists, The presidential level of commander-in-chief is shared by the international bankers. The people know that they credited, have created this fierce and financed it with their own taxes, which is consent, but they would rather knuckle under than to be the hypocrite. Thus, a nation becomes divided into two very distinct parts: a docile sub-nation, great silent majority, and a political sub-nation. The political sub-nation remains attached to the docile sub-nation, tolerates it, and leeches uh, its substance until it grows strong enough to detach itself and then devour its parents. So that takes us to the concept of interpersonal dependency, needing others for social interaction, communication, or validation. This is also what allows social media and virtualized environments to be so powerful. Now, addiction dependency, being dependent on substances or behaviors due to addictive tendencies. This also weaponizes the tendency for people to avoid struggle and nullify acceptance of life on real life terms. We are able to form escapes that prevent us from addressing the underlying conditions and thereby exist in the coping zone. And let me break that down. When we talk about existing in the coping zone, this is when within the Black Panther Party, we talk about how coping is used in exchange for actual living. And as a people, we go into what's called survival mode, which is coping. Coping is learning how to deal with obstacles, whether you become and learning to basically become good at overcoming obstacles. But the problem with that is that being in survival mode and simply focus on overcoming obstacles does not remove those obstacles. So oppression as being an obstacle, as being something we cope with, we basically just condition ourselves to be able to survive the onslaught aspects of oppression, as opposed to freeing ourselves from oppression. When you are freeing yourselves from it, then the obstacle is no longer there for the next generations to have to endure. But when you are simply coping with it, what you do is you teach the next generations how to cope. You teach the next generations how to jump further, duck sooner, go around, but everything other than actually taking up accountability of actual solution bearing responsibility and eliminating the obstacles of oppression. And that's what's important, because in essence, that's what's being stated in this document here. And that's what they mean when they talk about the laziness. But going back to what Sister Crystal stated, remember, we are at war. And so we are taught to be lazy. We are taught through the school system how not to think in a proper fashion, which we refer to as linear thinking. And so therefore, our people are basically taught to be subjugated as it applies to that. So silent weapon extract number 3. Diversion, the primary strategy. Experience has prevent that the simplest methods of securing a silent weapon and gaining control of the public is to keep the public undisciplined and ignorant of the basic system principles on the one hand, while keeping them confused, disorganized, and distracted with matters of no real importance on the other hand. This is achieved by disengaging their minds, sabotaging their mental activities, providing a low quality program of public education in mathematics. Hold on just a second. Low education in, public education in mathematics, logic, system design, and economics, and discouraging technical creativity. Engaging their emotions, increasing their self-indulgence and their indulgence in emotions and physical activities by unrelenting emotional affirmations and attacks, mental and emotional rape by way of constant barrage of sex, violence, and wars in media, especially the TV and the newspapers, giving them whatever they desire in excess, and that's the key here, in excess, which is junk food for thought, and depriving them of what they really need, rewriting history and laws, and subject the public to the deviant creations, thus being able to shift their thinking from personal needs to highly fabricated outside priorities. These preclude their interest in and discovery of the silent weapon of social automation technology. The general rule is that there is a profit in confusion. The more confusion, the more profit. Therefore, the best approach is to create problems and then offer solutions. And that's the key here, is when you create problems, then you come back and offer solutions, and that makes you appear as though you are actually on their side. And so the masses of people, because they're not recognizing what's going on with all of this mental destruction and warfare, they think that when the government provides a solution, that government is not actually the one that created the problem. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move on. Next form of dependency here is what we call role dependency, relying on others to fulfill specific roles and responsibilities, which go into what we talk about when we get into the aspects of the politicians that we're talking about. Dependency in relationships, relying upon others for love, intimacy, and security. That takes us to what we talk about class citizenship. Refers to a class of social and economic positional power held by a specific group that influences their access to rights, opportunities, and privileges within society. Which one thing we got to keep in mind, folks, if y'all are not paying attention to, striking down of affirmative action is going to lead to more levels of class citizenship. Extract number 4 here. Energy, the key to dependency. Since energy is the key to all activity on the face of the earth, it follows that in order to maintain a monopoly of energy, raw materials, goods, and services, and to establish a world system of slave labor, it is necessary to have a first strike capability in the fields of economics. In order to maintain our position, it is necessary that we have absolute first knowledge of the science of control over all economic factors and the first experience at engineering the world economy. In order to achieve self-sovereignty, we must at least achieve this one end, that the public would not make either a logical or mathematical connection between the economics and the other energy sciences, or learn to apply such knowledge. And what's important about that, people, is that oftentimes we're not taught what was called applied mathematics, applied physics, applied electronics, applied anything. When we're typically taught science, certain elements of science, it has nothing to do with the application of it. This is why oftentimes when we come out of school and we look back, we don't feel like we have a use for geometry, calculus, and other things that we may have learned simply to get a grade so that we can go into a specific profession, and that things that we were taught are not able to be applied to our day-to-day lives. And so it's important that we recognize that the system, as it applies to that, is not meant to teach you how to basically be self-empowered. You can't expect a system of oppression to teach you how to be unoppressed. A system of oppression, especially when we're talking about this as it applies to imperialism, can teach the individual how to basically subjugate other individuals and thereby be able to alleviate themselves to a high level of class struggle. But in doing so, obviously what you're doing at that point, it is you're basically buying into the concept of exploitation and okay with the fact that in order for you to be well off, other people have to suffer and other people have to be taken advantage of. Which takes us to the Hegelian dialectic. So that goes into what we call here, oppressive powers in government have created economic chaos, shortages in food and fuel, consulatory taxation, a crisis in education, a threat of war, and other diversions to condition Americans for the New World Order. The technique is as old as politics itself, as the Hegelian principles of bringing about change in a 3-step process, which is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The first step, thesis, is to create a problem. And that's what we're talking about here. You start off by creating the problem. The second step is antithesis, which is to generate opposition to the problem through fear, panic, and hysteria. Third, you come in with the synthesis to offer a solution to the problems created in step 1, change which would have been impossible to impose on the people without the proper psychological conditioning achieved in stages 1 and 2. Applying this and irreversible financial influence, concealed motives seek and to dismantle social and political structures by which free men govern themselves, ancient landmarks erected in great cost in blood and treasure. Their objective is to emasculate sovereign states, merge nations under universal government, centralize economic power, and control the world, people, and resources. There is a link to something that kind of goes over this as well at the very bottom when we talk about resources. And see, again, what's important about the stuff that we're going over is that if we don't recognize how warfare is being waged on us, then we can't define the proper means of support and the proper means of addressing what we need to do to fortify ourselves against this. And that's the whole aspect, again, even going back to when you talk about United States military and other militaries as it applies to what they call strategic warfare. Strategic warfare has to do with the nuclear capabilities and making sure that nation has a one-up advantage on other nations. This is why also the UN does not allow or want other nations to be able to gain nuclear technology, because when they gain nuclear technology, then they're able to create nuclear weapons. If they're able to create nuclear weapons, then it's a situation for where your big gun and my big gun neutralizes the idea of guns. So therefore, I'm not in a position anymore as being the United States to bully you on the world court because you got the same level of destructive power that I have. And so this is one of the big issues with that. That also takes it to the next aspect of recognizing that as humans continue to create larger and more destructive weapons of war, it comes a time when those weapons will be deployed, and all we're doing at that point is wiping each other out. So this is why we have to be able to stop the imperialist destruction that's taking place right now. So let's go into one aspect of dependency a lot of people don't connect the dots to: foreign aid dependency. The nature of economic aid almost intrusively causes what is increasingly known as political dependency by encouraging donor intervention in political processes. Donors need to satisfy the interests, values, and incentives of the home country by providing them with expected results in order to maintain the cash flow. This has resulted in donors either bypassing and therefore destabilizing government service provisions process to establish donor projects, a strategy often favored by U.S. aid and the World Bank, are intervening directly in policymaking and implementation. I know that's a little wordy, but basically what we're saying here is it creates what's referred to as a codependency on that foreign aid, and through that foreign aid is actually implemented to create corruption within government, and therefore the money that is provided through foreign aid, majority of it never makes it down to to actually changing and growing the infrastructure to the point to where it no longer needs that foreign aid. The idea here is to keep the money flowing. Therefore, that country maintains a certain level of dependency on that external money and external resources, by which is exchanged with political power, which typically means that that foreign country is going to have access to natural resources that the citizens of that land should actually be in control of. But because now we're dealing with regimes that have been placed in power as a result of foreign aid and foreign interest, and like I say a lot of times, the job of what the CIA does, because of this, now you have this cycle of destruction that continues to go on, that perpetuates itself and never ends. But oftentimes we don't realize that. So most of us don't recognize what's going on with foreign aid. Next one here, as it applies to foreign aid, the involvement of donors, either foreign governments or international agencies, in recipient country political process has been shown to reduce the quality of governments. It reduces leader accountability. The government is playing to two audiences simultaneously, the donors and to the public. This means that the direction of accountability, and that's why we highlighted that, underline that, the direction of accountability is between the government and the donor rather than the public, risking government legitimacy and delaying the process of political reform and development. This is particularly damaging in countries where the need for aid stems from political upheaval and civil unrest. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zimbabwe, which have a lengthy history of aid dependence. The risk here is that donors will have political leverage, thus decision and planning become relevant on the donor involved, whose motive and values do not align with those of the public or the government. This also ties into the sale, import/export of cocaine, opium, and other commodities illegal in the US for the sake of duly serving to fund the war on drugs that contribute to the foreign national gross national product, and allowing US to systematically attack and neutralize the internal non-agreeables, which basically blacks, within its own population sector. This takes us to the term referred to as second-class citizens. So what we're recognizing here is that we're talking about how we become under attack and how systems of codependency continues to create areas of repetitive dependency. So second-class citizen. A person who is systematically and actively discriminated against within a state or a political jurisdiction, despite their normal status as a citizen or legal resident there. While not necessarily slaves, outlaws, illegal immigrants, or criminals, second-class citizens have significantly limited rights, civil rights, and social economic opportunities, and are often subject to mistreatment and exploitation at the hands of their punitive superiors. Governmental systems with second-class citizenry are widely regarded as violating human rights. That's why when we talk about reparations and we talk about dealing with the repair of what's constantly being bombarded, that goes into human rights violations, which is used as a means of reparations. And that's just a link, a wiki link to it, to this information here. Typical conditions facing second-class citizens include, but are not limited to, disenfranchisement or lack or loss of voting rights, limitations on civil or military service, not including conscription in every case, restrictions on language, religion, and education, which basically goes into being stripped of your natural language, your natural religion, and a proper educational system. Lack of freedom of movement, expression, and association, which, as an example of that, goes into what's referred to as Black identity extremism, which basically means to have a Black identity makes you an extremist, which makes you a homegrown terrorist. Limitations on the right to keep and bear arms, restrictions on marriages, restrictions on housing, restrictions on property ownership. And remember, the billionaires are buying up land all over the world. Bill Gates is constantly buying up land. Anybody want to make a comment or a feedback on what we've talked about so far, or has a question?
I just want to say that dependence has been misconstrued. When I grow up, I raise my kids, I want them to depend on me, with the caveat that at some point they do not need to depend on me, but it's been infiltrated by the communists that have taken it and turned it into something that you can never be released from. You're always going to be dependent upon them the way that they've constructed it. It's not designed to grow. It's designed to have you stuck in that system.
Well, that goes into what we talk about when we say creating economic dependence. So the point within an economic dependence is making sure that you are constantly bogged down within a condition that creates what they call credits, so that you always are living beyond your means, and so now you need to borrow. And when you borrow, you're borrowing at an interest rate, and that interest rate, in effect, is paying for your enslavement through the economic system by which you are borrowing from, which you can never catch up with. And when you do catch up with it, you turn right around and borrow more, because you're constantly being fed to be consumers and to keep up with the Joneses and to get the latest and greatest iPhone 2.0, 3.0, and so on and so forth, Air Jordans, and everything that goes into creating a system of exploitation and creating an indulgence that causes us to actually not recognize what it means to be accountable in terms of our own means of production. Galaxy Note 8, you got your hand up. And then we go to you, Crystal.
Free the
By
land.
by any means, General.
I agree with what has been said, but being in the groups I've been in, I certainly try to simplify what's been going on. But it appears to me, as we listen to the things that go around in our nation, children are being shot in the schools and whatnot. I just don't see where the nation is beyond Willie Lynch and Jim Crow.
Right.
In terms of our psychology and how we look at each other. If we can't look at each other as being the answer, and I'm talking about the nation,
right. Yep.
We are not qualified. We are not qualified to make a difference or even show great examples outside of the nation of this country. If we're still distracted just behind black on black crime, the blood is still running down the streets of this nation. We have to, get a grip on our social and economic behavior toward one another.
Right.
Then we can flex some power. But I still agree that with what you said, Brother Robert, with the dependency or the codependency.
Yeah.
On that level, because of the fact that we've yet to create a basic fundamental platform where we look at each other as being important to this nation. Thank you.
Thank you. And what's important about what was just stated there is that too often we go back into what we call victimization mode, and we just stay in this level to where we want to just constantly place blame, say, so to speak, on the white man, that kind of mentality. Not to say that it is not a European problem, obviously, that continues to create this subjugation. But what we have to recognize is we, at this point, especially this moment in time, have to take ownership for being victimized and for living in a victimization mentality, because it's the mentality of victimization that causes us to basically destroy each other to the point to where we can't come together and unify to create and continually create levels of empowerment. Going back to what Crystal stated earlier, and it was mentioned multiple times, we have constantly created what's referred to as Black Wall Streets or Black communities that were empowered. But as we do so, they're constantly attacked. But that goes back to why I said we have to define, develop, and then be able to defend what we have defined and developed. And the problem we keep running into is that we think that we can coexist within a system without a means of defense or self-defense. And that's part of the biggest element. When you talk about natural law and you talk about just life forms in general, every life form has a defense mechanism that protects it against anything foreign or against any elements of external attack. Why is it that when we build systems, we don't think the same way? When everything shows us that it is impossible to build without a means of defending what it is that you build. But we have to also have a collective mentality and a collective operation and synchronization in action in order to be able to come together and make this happen. So thank you for that. So that takes us to, hold on a second, Crystal, did you have something you wanted to say real quick?
Yeah, real quick. Well, number one, I forgot. Thank you for inviting me to be on the Zoom. Much appreciated. And number two, you brought up the Hegelian dialectical, and the prime example I wanted to say is with the COVID-19. Okay, they created the virus. Yep. They stirred up the panic, and then they say, "Oh, hurry up, we got a solution, and you better take it, or you're gonna lose your job. You're not gonna go to school." And now, when we put out the information, there was a biological weapon. Don't do it. Now they're saying, putting out reports, well, you took it voluntarily, because now that the class actions are coming out and all of that. So we have to create independent streams of countering these things. So how do you break a codependency? At some point, one of the codependents has to resist. And I wanted to wonder, you were talking about foreign aid and how they use the constantly giving you aid as a form of codependency. But if we also look at ourselves as a nation, which we are, as disorganized as we may be, as new Africans, on a micro level, the same thing is being done with these thousands of 501c3s that are getting resources from these foundations, and the foundations are from the same families of the Rothschilds and Rockefellers and the globalists. And then part of the caveat is you can't speak against the things that are going on. You can't do political action. You can't do this, can't do that. And you have thousands of 501c3s, yet they can't seem to do anything to affect our communities. And here we have our Black Panther formations with a few volunteers putting our money in, and we can seem to go in and try to have some impact. And goes to with the police brutality and the genocide that we see. You know, these are acts of constant terrorism. So when we go in, our people appear to be so bombarded in constant survival mode. So how do we, and I guess that's going to be later in the class, how do we break the codependencies? Like, what are some of the solutions of breaking the codependencies? And lastly, I think we should be careful as to saying what we can't do, because there are things that we are doing, you know, but just saying in general, we can't do this until we do that. We can't do this until we do that. I mean, we are seeing a paradigm shift taking place in a lot of ways that we need to start acknowledging. A lot of these tribes, street tribes, they're trying, you know, to break some of the violence. A lot of the, you know, more and more sisters are going natural, and more people are doing Black businesses, but there is a very major gap in developing this defense of these enterprises. So how do we break that? I guess that's another class, but it's just so important. Like what you're doing now is key, and we just got to get more and more people into these type of, you know, discussions, as opposed to the who beat up who on TV and who did this, all of the madness that we're being saturated with. Black power.
Thank you. Well, one aspect.
Can I go ahead?
Go ahead, Griff. Let me try that for a second.
Okay, thank you, sir. Ma'am, I'd like to address what you just said as far as solution solving. You know, me and Brother War used to always talk about solution solving. And when we look at our history and how we as a people, when we were self-sufficient, we had our own land, we had our own grocery stores, etc., is that we need to begin to get out our sense of complacency and comfort, meaning that we have to have a great migration. I believe that those that are revolutionary minded, we all need to be looking at, and I know people are not in the same finance state, but we all need to be looking at migrating. If you look at our ancestors, they migrated to different states to be strong in numbers. I believe that we're at the point in a revolution that different formations need to come. That's why we were talking about an elders council, and we need to come and find a state to where we can be prosperous as a revolutionary movement as a whole. I know down here in Texas, speaking of Austin, is one of the fastest growing cities with one of the best economies. And so it's a lot of land in Texas. So we need to be thinking about, you know, buying land, building, once again, affluent African-American communities. Like Brother Ward say, begin to invest in our own banks. We definitely need our own main grocery stores like H-E-B, like Walmart's that are Black owned. You see what I'm saying? We're thinking small. You see what I'm saying? So I think one of the problems is that if we migrate, you know, everybody pull their resources in, begin to build a strong foundation in the state, and then begin to migrate their families this way. You know, men left and they worked on the railroad, or they worked and they built a home and they bought property, and then they went and brought their family back in. And so I truly believe that it'll be more effective, us as a people, and have a revolutionary movement as a whole, to migrate to a state, buy some land, let's buy some buildings and begin to get our own schools. We have teachers, we have everything we need but we just don't have an effective game plan. So I believe that's one of the ways of solution solving. I yield with that.
One thing that does go into, and it's a book I would suggest all y'all check out. Not to say this is the answer in itself, because we have to be able to use all tools in the toolbox. But it's a book called The Devil You Know. And I would suggest y'all check that book out as it applies to the stuff that Brother Griff is talking about. Let me keep moving. We're actually almost toward the end of the class. But real quick, in terms of something that Crystal brought up about the solution here, the thing about that is we have to, what we talk about within the Panther formations is what we refer to as a trifactor. Parts of the trifactor go into what we call physical, mental, and spiritual. Realizing that we have to take on things from a holistic approach as it applies to fighting the proper fight, physical, mental, and spiritual. The thing with compartmentalizing, kind of going into what you stated, that we can't say that we have to do this before we do this. The deal is we have to have a holistic approach in terms of recognizing, one, that we are at war, two, that we are under attack, and that we are being attacked from all sides. So therefore, in essence, we have to fight back from all sides. The thing about that is waking the people up to the recognition that we have to be willing to move away from simply dealing with emancipation to a level of independence. But independence, in terms of talking about accountability, responsibility, and freedom, comes at a very strong price. Number one, let's go back to the element of what has been created as a result of our enslavement, which is domestication. When you talk about the people that have been domesticated, they have been conditioned to not want freedom. They've been conditioned to want the benefits of a nation that is basically subjugating elements of freedom within even its own sector, because it is subjugating oppression across the entire world. So people may want good quality of living, but that good quality of living does not mean that you want it from the standpoint of creating your own. This is why we talk about the concept as it applies to the trifactor, the difference between understanding, understanding, and overstanding. Understanding is simply knowing how to use a car. Understanding is knowing how to perform maintenance on a vehicle when it breaks down. Overstanding would be in how to create and design and produce your own means of transportation. Most of us are completely happy with just simply living in a state of understanding. And when we living in a state of understanding, because that word gets used for everything that applies to learning something outside of what we, again, nonlinear quantitative development, which is where we should be at, we are simply learning how to be better systematic slaves. So that's part of the problem, is getting us on a synchronized page, and the key is synchronization. Synchronized page, even within our formations, to where we are able to come together for the sake of unification, and what ultimately leads to what we call singularity in terms of our thought process. So let me just kind of go over aspects of the 10-point platform that we utilize here in San Diego, for those that are not familiar with it. For the sake of elements that we talk about as it applies to removing ourselves from a position of state-sanctioned dependency. Number one, here we say we are gaining freedom. Other forms of the platform does not put you in a kinetic position when you talk about it. It says we want. So when you say that you want or you believe, you are operating, and this is why we have to be students of psychology, philosophy, and physics. Those three P's, which go into elements again of the trifactor: philosophy, physics, and psychology. Because we have to recognize that the words we use must be words of empowerment. So therefore, elements of the platform was changed to reflect kinetic operation, as opposed to saying that we want to put ourselves in a passive position. So in saying that, we say we are gaining freedom. We promote the power of practice and self-determination, determining the destiny of our communities and defining the Black nation. We embrace spiritually high moral code of our ancestors. We accept accountability This is key here. We accept accountability that Black people are free to collectively determine divine destiny, but we have to accept the accountability, and that's what it was important. Number two, we seek and establish avenues of proper living wages, wage employment for our people, and continuously disregard the practice of codependency from systematic and systemic and systematic modes of oppression. We know the plot to dumb down Black people in the likeness of domesticated consumers. We know that power only respects power, which speaks to what was stated earlier um, by a comrade. Therefore, our focus is transforming our economic consumer might into means of mass production, design, development, control, and operated by Black people. We promote accountability of our spending habits and practice currency and resource circulation within our communities and amongst our people first and foremost. Nothing stands in the way of our road to freedom and independence. The African giant is awake. African people, our time is now. So see what we did within the platform is we made everything operate from a kinetic position, because you first have to define and promote yourself from a position of power to get in the likeness and the mindset of that, and that is what you have to produce and push to the people. Number three, we actively empower our own legislative representatives in all areas of the United States government. Again, one element of within the tool shed, not saying that that is the full answer. Through our power of joint African-owned ventures and co-ops, Black people are developing our own control of land and full resources through self-determination. The housing, land, social, political, and economic institutions are being made into independent ujimas, new African communal cooperatives, so that our community is free to build and make drug-free, decent housing with health facilities for our people. We demand and actively participate in ending the capitalistic domination of Africa in all its forms: imperialism, criminal shelter colonization, neo-colonialism, racism, sexism, Zionism, apartheid, and artificial borders. Number five, we employ education for our people that exposes the true nature of the devilish, decadent American society. We provide an education that teaches us our true legacy and our role in present day society. We operate from an educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self. Having direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world develops our proper relationship to everything else. So kind of going into what was asked earlier in regards to how to go about it, I would just state this last one. We must operate from an educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self, which means we have to do that. Having direct knowledge of self, not indirect, but direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world, develops our proper relationship to everything else, which helps us be able to deal with the fact of black on black self-hate and crime and destruction, which is natural when you're operating from a position of chaos. Number 10, we are establishing land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace for our people in the contested zone. That's key. We recognize that we are in a contested zone, which means that we are in a war zone. So the platform was changed to address the fact that we must realize that we are in a war zone. As our national political objective with collective counsel of unity across other Black Panther formations, we aim to fashion a liberated zone in our communities in which grant our people power over educational, economic, and political institutions, in which we direct the participation toward the purpose of defining, developing, and defending our will and divine destiny as a people. So see, the platform in itself is basically stating what is going on. And thank you, Comrade Coyote, a protracted people's war. So I just wanted to throw that out there. The last part here of the class is just definitions to know for the subject matter foundation. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, before we get close to closing out, I do want to say that, again, if you want a copy of this document, to make sure to put your email, if you're not already within the San Diego groups, put your email in the chat, and then I'll make sure I get this document over to you. Now, the reason for this last portion here is because these words and these definitions help to give us a better, should I say, well-rounded point of view in terms of the things that we must be aware of when we talk about defining who we are as a people. So first one on the list would be Declaration of Independence. Now, the reason why we reference this is because we must ourselves understand the importance, or understand and overstand the importance of creating a declaration of an independence and thereby working toward a position of that independence. So it's like having affirmations. To consider yourself a free people, you have to first make a declaration that you will be a free people. And so that's what's important about that. Dialectical materialism states that everything is material, and that change takes place through the struggle of opposites. The conflict of opposing forces lead to growth, change, and development according to definite laws. Now, another one that's real important is epigenetics, the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Now, what's important about that, this goes into what we deal with when we talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. So we're saying here that it can be identifiable as parts of the factors in post-traumatic slave syndrome, because epigenetics plays a strong role in why generational after generation we have what the ghetto mentality, and the Willie Lynch is able to survive, sustain itself, and can operate through a perpetual operation. Part of that goes into this, which also goes into active engagements of eugenics, which is a study of how to arrange reproduction within human population to increase and in concurrence of hereditable characteristics regarded as desirables, as well as to destroy certain lines of undesirables. So we have to understand that. We have to know what government means. We have to understand a guerrilla, international law, macroeconomics. Earlier it was talked about microeconomics, so we have to understand macroeconomics, what it is to be a non-combatant, plebiscite, politics, prisoner of war, provisional government. And this is what we also need to be going to: a temporary government prior to establishing a complete control of land resources and the control of all resources tied to the land. We have to be involved in what this is and understand what that is. Psychological operations, which go into what we're talking about now. What is a rebellion? Remittance, which goes into the aspect of why people that are foreigners can come over here, work certain jobs, and then they send their money back home to increase the resources, which creates the ties back to this country, and which is also ties into foreign aid, and also ties into why folks from outside of the country can come back into this country and do better than those that have been subjugated and oppressed throughout generations of us in this country. Now let me read this last one here in regards to, on this page, revolutionary as a way of life, because this is important and everybody on here should be operating and recognize this. This is one of the ones that I would suggest you even make a copy of and post on your wall. Revolutionary as a way of life. Number one, should understand that the people are more advanced socially than politically, because what we're dealing with is people that need to become politically astute, which is why we give in political education class. And again, exchange these concepts even here where it says understand, to understand and overstand. Okay, so should understand and be able to explain the value of education, because a lot of the youth do not recognize the value of education because it's not being applied in terms of building a way of life. It is being utilized in order to keep you and maintain levels of oppression. So we're not valuing education properly. Should understand the difference between education and miseducation, and be competent in articulating the kinds of education we need to advance ourselves. That's the key. Number four, should understand that education alone won't free us. Only the application of what we learn, the circumstances we are faced with, will produce the lives we envision for ourselves. Holding yourself accountable. Number five, must be able to give solutions to the problems that plague the people. Number six, must be disciplined in his or her ways. Number seven, must understand and be able to explain that revolution is a process, not a conclusion. Number eight, must be learned in history, politics, economics, religious history, the mafia, and that's important, Willie Lynch indoctrination, psychology, sociology, science, and dialectics, period. Number 9, must understand that a revolutionary has 1,000 teachers and 1,000,000 students. Number 10, should possess at least one vocational skill, carpentry, garden, auto mechanics, etc. Because again, we have to be employers of ourselves and producers of ourselves. Number 11, should be drug free, diet conscious, and physically fit. 12, should be able to explain the cause of particular actions, especially concerning the actions of governments and nations. 13, must possess above average auditory skills. 14, must master the science of storytelling. 15, should strive to keep their actions in line with their words and prefer actual facts over opinions. 16, should be able to make the connections between past, present, and future constructs for visionary growth and pattern recognition. And without that concept of being able to recognize the link between the trifecta, the past, present, and future constructs, then if you're not able to do that, you're not able to deal with visionary growth, and therefore we won't see the patterns of oppression that constantly hold us back, and therefore we're not able to outpace the pace of oppression. Number 17, must be entirely committed to the people and the freedom struggle. 18, must be able to relate revolution in the modern day context and be able to and make it applicable to real life situations. 19, must evolve with the times by being a keen observer and learn from the success and failures of past revolutions. 20, is a guerrilla warrior and must be able to teach the different methods of war, psychological, biological, and chemical. 21, must be able to use entertainment to educate the sleeping masses. 22, must be able to discern and scientifically analyze the capitalist view of supply and demand, which is why we gave the whole point in the introduction to the concept of silent weapons for quiet wars. If we are to realize how we are being led and destroyed and made sheeple, which is the next definition, we have to understand what capitalism is. We have to understand what supply and demand is. We have to understand how these things create these perpetual cycles that keep us in a situation to where we are constantly living under the gun of never being able to get involved in a position where we are able to empower ourselves through our own resource control. And because of that, we are turned off to that. So we become consumers. That consumer relationship that we have with the oppressor basically allows us to be codependent upon them producing and us constantly being the consumers. So even as it applies to that relationship itself, that codependency aspect is the fact that the reason they produce is because we consume. The reason they produce more is because we consume more, which gets them rich. And they get in a cycle of constantly being rich, and we get in a cycle of constantly being poor because they know that how that codependency works. They get how that operation is designed. We are the ones that continue to fall for it and think that it's going to change, which takes us to sheeple. People who are docile, complacent, or easily influenced. People likened to sheep dependent, domesticated. Keyword I keep throwing at you is domesticated. We have to know what sovereignty means. State, symbolic racism, territory, and end on toys. Toys as an acronym, tools of your surrounding. This defines the space of an operational battlefield. When in battle, the soldier must take the total of the surroundings as a useful tool of combat. All before you either be used to aid you or destroy you. Your awareness and use of this fact will determine the outcome of the battle. So if you are not engaging in recognizing all of the resources at your disposal, then your enemy will turn around and sell you these same resources that you are supposed to control right back to you and cause you to constantly stay in a dependent status with them. And there's just a few links that I sent here, as well as you can see links. You can scan this with your phone and get more information on us in San Diego, as well as go to the Panther 48 channel, which this class will eventually end up on that website. Any questions or comments or closing points? Go ahead, Galaxy.
Free the land.
By any means.
Brother General, thank you for inviting. It's good to hear Sister Crystal's voice. I did want to make a comment on the examples of Black people over 100 years. The last great mecca of economic improvement was Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
That was the last great mecca in this nation. And it's been said that while Black Wall Street was thriving, Wall Street and the stock market in New York, people jumping out of buildings in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Black Wall Street was great, but the children of Black Wall Street could never rebuild it. So we have examples, documented examples on the improvement in the way African or the way Black people think. I just think that Black Wall Street is a significant example on what we did in the last 100 years. Thank you.
And thank you, General Scott. And what's even more important than just what most people refer to as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is the fact that most cities, major cities, had Black Wall Streets. And that suppression of information is one of the things that they use against us to constantly get us to only refer back to one specific quote unquote Black Wall Street. And by us thinking that that is our only shining grace, it puts us again in a mode that we can't collectively do this across the nation, and that we don't have the power to constantly reproduce this. There were plenty of examples of thriving Black neighborhoods that were well off, but most of that information, most of those examples have been suppressed, and history has been rewritten so that the people don't realize that they can do it anywhere, as opposed to only thinking about this one example. So that's one thing I did want to say, that even that in itself has been weaponized, and the information that it continually happened all across the United States, which goes into the fact that the reason it happened is because we have no choice but to be self-sufficient and depend upon ourselves. When we are in a position where we cannot be operating through a simulation, then we're forced to a position where we have to be able to do for self. Then maybe we will do for self. Hopefully it doesn't have to become that way. But right now, we are seeing all the writings and signs on the wall that elements of our rights are being stripped from us. Racism is on the rise. Attacks are being more propagated. But we're having this whole thing, all this stuff come with also from a global standpoint. So there's a lot to consider in terms of where this nation is going to be, as opposed to even just us as Black people in the next 10 years. Anybody else have any closing points before we get out?
Brother Ward, I don't know, do you do this every Thursday?
No, we do it, it's random. Usually we at least get two in a month, but I will add you to the list and start sending the feeds to you. But they're always on Thursdays at this time.
Okay, every Sunday from 2 p.m. Central, which is 12 noon Pacific, we do political education as well. So I would love for you to come and be a guest presenter. And, and also the next time I will make sure that I let our comrades know to get on, because the more we're collectively, working together and showing by example, and getting the information out, like I can share, with your permission, I would like to share it when you post it up on your Panther 48 page. We post it up on our NBPP channel as well. Yeah. Because that is a platform that I can honestly say that we're getting more engaged with, because we've been focusing on our radio broadcast nightly. But, as we're getting more technically astute, we need to share this information and show collaboration and Black Power. Salute, General Scott. I didn't know that was you. Galaxy, Black Power. I love this.
Oh yes, ma'am. It's me. Same to you, sister. I was just frantically trying to get online. I had a little problem with Zoom, but yeah, it's all great. You know what I'm saying? I've been knowing y'all for 20 some odd years, and I know how passionate y'all are, and with a little help, because if we depended on you, Brother Robert, and the rest of them, it would have been done a long time ago. But it just happens to be, this is a nation building thing. It's not a personal thing. And so to sit and listen to you and to listen to Brother Robert, that I've been knowing for 20 some odd years, it's always inspiring that you still have that consciousness going. Free the land.
Vice versa. By any means.
All right, before we close out, if there's anybody else that want to send their email so that I can make sure you get the document.
Yeah, brother. Well, I'm gonna send it to you. You know, I didn't. I don't think I did it the way that I could see it. I just did it by phone call. But I want to also thank you for the invite from the New Black Panther Party up under the leadership of Attorney Malik Zulu Shabazz. I feel like the sister and as the general, and as you stated earlier, we are all tools in the toolbox to rebuild and create the community. I wanted to interject here on the note of Black Wall Street. Let's keep in mind the concept that Marcus Garvey brought, not only being self-sufficient and having our own business, but the representation of our people. So you believe, so you are. He said, you know, go to work looking your best. You know, wherever you go, look your best and represent your people. I think we, as a collective whole, has got away from that. You know, we're outside, we're everywhere looking like anything. We don't really keep the structure of a strong Black man with dignity and class and character. Brother Ward spoke on that ghettoish mentality, which is an attribute of the Willie Lynch syndrome. And so, you know, I think that a lot of us should study the concept in depth of how Marcus Garvey brought our people together with class and standards. So I yield there.
Thank you, Comrade Grill. All right, with that being said, I'll make sure I get this over to everyone that shot your email in. All power to the people.